name is Paula Harris, and I'm an international photojournalist, and I'm very honored today to be in Toronto, Canada, May 7th, 2010, to interview the Honorable Paul Hellyer. It's been a pleasure to return to Canada after my 2005 interview with Paul, when he talked about several controversial issues, one being the UFO question and the lack of transparency in the government cover-up. But today we are very honored because Paul has written 2 books, and we're going to discuss them on camera, and they are Light at the End of the Tunnel, A Survival Plan for the Human Species, and that's the book that will also encompass the ET UFO question, among other real serious world issues. And Paul's book on A Miracle in Waiting, Economics That Makes Sense. And this book for Paul is a real masterpiece of economics. He's done a great deal of study on this. So these are the 2 books that have just been released, and the debut of these 2 books. And Paul has kindly consented to answer a few questions that all of us have for him. Paul, in 2005 was an important year for you. Several things happened in 2005, the last time I was here. And since we're talking about Light at the End of the Tunnel, the book, was that part of your thinking in 2005 that you would come out with a book? And would you talk a little bit about that year?
No, at that time had no idea that I would write this book. It didn't take too long after that to decide that I wanted to write sort of a final book as a legacy. But in 2005, I was still getting over the death of my late wife, Ellen, and sort of living alone, and decided to ask the widow of my best friend ever, Bill Bussiere, if she would consider marrying me. She had been a widow for 10 years, and she said yes. So we planned our wedding for October the 1st, 2005, and that is the year that I really got interested in the extraterrestrial presence and technology. Really for the first time. I had been Minister of National Defense in Canada and had received reports on sightings, which said this one was a natural phenomenon, this was not explained, but never really been into it. But that year, I read Colonel Corso's book, A Day After Roswell, and came to the conclusion that it was real and that this was an important issue. And so I made a statement at an exopolitics symposium at the University of Toronto, and said UFOs are as real as the planes flying over your head, and that it's time that the United States government started coming clean on what it's all about, because there are very important military and economic issues that have to be addressed. And how can you address a question which relates to a subject that people don't even won't admit exists?
Can we pick up that last question, that last line?
Yeah. How can you discuss a question which the United States government doesn't officially recognize as being on the radar?
You told me also in an informal conversation that you thought this was going to be a one-shot deal. You thought you were just going to appear, I think it was the University of Toronto, and ask the important questions that you asked and make the important statements that you made, and then all at once, 5 years later, we're still, is it intriguing you? Is this why?
Well, I had no idea. See, this speech was made just a week before I got married, and I asked my future bride if it was okay, and she was hesitant, she was reluctant. But I said, well, this will just be a one-off shot. I'd want to get this out in the open for discussion. And she said, okay, to go ahead. Well, little did I dream where it was going to lead, because, of course, after I was public, then people wanted to talk to me, and I wanted to do some research. I have been saying that I was just in the kindergarten of UFO knowledge in 2005. I'm probably in grade 5 or 6 now, after doing a lot of research in the intervening 5 years, and I have read many, many books, and I now know more about the subject than majority of people, and I felt when I thought of writing another book as a legacy that I should include a chapter, a primer really, on the subject of the extraterrestrial presence and technology, and also to make a plea for full disclosure, because the implications of what has been going on secretly in the last 50 or 60 years are really profound, and most people haven't any idea how important the revelations could be to their future as a species.
Paul, you said you became very interested in the question because of policy issues and sociological issues, and your book, Light at the End of the Tunnel, A Survival Plan for the Human Species, has actual first-hand information because you spoke to quite a few people. Some of the people that you spoke to are people like Travis Walton, Fire in the Sky, Colonel Halt from the Bentwaters case in England, Nick Pope, who worked for the Ministry of Defense in England, Dr. Edgar Mitchell, Apollo 14 astronaut Shirley MacLaine, and several other people who are first-hand sources for the whole UFO question. It isn't just that you read the books. Would you tell me, while you were speaking to all these people, what was going on in your mind and which person you found the most, not shocking, but the most impressive of all your research?
Well, when you use the word impressive, they were all impressive. So I wouldn't want to single out one for that. I first of all, as you know, was briefed by a number of very knowledgeable people, including Dr. Stephen Greer, who gave me a 3-hour briefing on the people that he had assembled, the 400 contacts of people from all walks of life who knew much from personal experience about this subject. And then as I went along, I wanted to talk to other people, and for example, I wanted to interview a couple of contactees, and they included Travis Walton, whose story was just, tremendously interesting. And I talked to him for a long while, over a couple of days, and was totally convinced that he was telling the truth. But you learn a lot from talking to these people. He had a heck of a time when he was dumped off 5 days later after his abduction, convincing people that it wasn't all a ruse. And he said the division was about 50-50, about half of his friends and relatives believed him and about half didn't. It took him a long while to recover psychologically from the experience. Another contactee that I interviewed at great length was Jim Sparks. And Jim has been abducted probably more often than anybody else that I've talked to. And he was tremendously interesting because at the outset he would fight these people and swear at them and do all of these things. Eventually he came to the point where he trusted them, and they trusted him, and he got a lot of information. And he wrote a book about his experience, and he gave me permission to use one of the most interesting quotes from that book, several pages actually, of a dialogue he had with the extraterrestrials, in which they indicated their concern about what was happening on Earth, that we were fouling up our rivers and our lakes and fouling up the air that we breathe with particles and really destroying our natural environment. And they're concerned about this, and they wanted him to tell the world about it. And so they of course encouraged him to pass the word along, which he's been doing both in lectures and through his book, but also to plump for amnesty for a lot of people in the event that the government does decide to open up the windows a little bit and let the light shine in. And the reason for that was because some of the people involved in what they call the black operations, the reverse engineering of the technology that came from the crashes and other contact with the extraterrestrials, is so interesting and so secret that certain elements of the United States government wanted to keep it secret even from their political leaders. And they've been working underground for years and years and years, and heaven only knows what they've accomplished, but in my opinion, it would be a very great deal. And certainly one of the things that I want to know is whether, in fact, they have developed exotic fuels like zero-point energy and cold fusion, as some people who have worked there have indicated that they have, because this is the way that we could transform our world in a time frame of maybe 10 years or so, and save it from global warming. And of course, the other thing I say in the book is that even if that is not true, that the extraterrestrials would give us that technology if we asked them to, because they want us to save our world as a habitable place for ourselves and for their visits.
These are some very incredible witnesses, and Stephen Greer, you mentioned the Disclosure Project of 2009, where he has military people, apart from military intelligence people who are involved. So this is a real cover-up. It's not something we're inventing, and it's very complicated, Paul, isn't it? Because the United States government still has not admitted that Roswell was real. We're still at a mogul balloon with crash test dummies.
You know, they're still maintaining the fantasy that it was a balloon, and it's, and so many people know that that's a lie.
Okay, can I cut here? If you have to kind of repeat the information in her question, otherwise people don't know you're talking about Roswell.
Oh.
So he was talking, but he didn't mention Roswell, so we don't know.
Okay, so what'll happen is you will keep my question in there, right?
If you want, but I have the mic on him. I'm picking it up, but it's. We can do it however you want.
Okay, just say in the Roswell incident, you're correct.
Okay, camera's rolling.
In the case of the Roswell crash, for example, they still claim that it didn't happen. But there were witnesses of all kinds who say it did. And the cover-up was in fact a lie, and that's what I call it in my book. And they started working on reverse engineering immediately after that, and had some of the best brains in the United States working on it, and have had ever since. So the distance they have come in 60 years or more is I'm sure, incredible, and that they have developed probably spaceships, and they have probably developed exotic fuels, and there are all sorts of things that the United States people and the people of the world have a right to know about. And that's the reason that we should never give up until there is full disclosure. But this has to be done by Congress. This has to be done by the people who have been funding them without knowing what they were funding. Because it's not something that one person would want to undertake on their own, say the president, for example, because I think it's just too dangerous. But then once they decide to go this route, they should grant an amnesty, as Jim Sparks suggested after talking to the extraterrestrials, so that people will be able to talk honestly under oath and not fear the consequences if they have committed some sort of major or minor crime in the course of their careers.
Now, the Edgar Mitchell, Apollo 14 astronaut, has gone before the Washington Press Club and said Roswell was real, that he was briefed, plus the fact that we had the 2001 Disclosure Project in Washington, D.C., all those witnesses that Stephen Greer brought together. We couldn't have more witnesses. What do you think is the blockage for full disclosure? And because other countries have come out with the fact that there is a UFO presence and that there are documents and there are sightings, other countries have done it. What do you think is the blockage?
Well, the blockage, I think, is really a desire on the part of a very small group in the United States to keep a lot of secrets to themselves and not to share them with either other people in their own country or with the world. And why they're doing this, whether there's a financial advantage to the United States or financial advantage to the oil industry, for example, of keeping the existence of exotic fuels a secret, I can't say for sure. But I'm pretty sure that there's somebody that's benefiting or think that they're benefiting from the power or the advantage, monetary advantage, of maintaining this exclusive little club that they've got, which knows a lot of things that the rest of us don't know.
Do you look at the whole extraterrestrial question as a benign question? Because people that are in the know are in two camps, good and bad, or evil and good extraterrestrial presence. How do you look at it? Is it not so that if it were not benign in some way, they may have done something to us long ago when we invented the atom bomb? Or?
Yeah, I think they're benign, but they're, as you well know, several species that we know about. And of course, the United States government sometimes has told people that there's one species that is not, but they never say who it is or which one, and consequently there's no way of checking it out without this kind of disclosure that we're demanding, because they may just be putting us on as an excuse for spending hundreds of billions of dollars to arm Earth against the extraterrestrials. And this is, I think, something that bothers me a lot or concerns me.
Tell me, so many people in the know, like astronauts, military people, you as ex-Minister of Defense, want to address this question, and even the Vatican has come forth and made the statement that the ET is our brother and sister. How do you think that we can approach this with the general public so that there is no panic and no pressure and no change in the status quo? Or do you think there will be a change in the status quo?
I think the public is prepared to accept it. Certainly if it is revealed in layers and not all in one fell swoop, because it takes getting used to. I went through this too. You start out knowing a little bit and saying, well, this is fine, and these people are benign, and they've got a lot to teach us. And one of the things that comes through loud and clear from all the research that I've done, that they are in fact more spiritual than we are, that we're less spiritually advanced than they are. And so we should look at them not as enemy, but as brothers and sisters, and try and work with them for our own benefit and theirs as well. But I think, you've have talked to a lot of people who realize that at some stage this UFO file was turned over to industry. And the U.S. government lost control of it. And ever since then, and it's a long time back, it goes right back to Eisenhower's day, and this was the reason he was so concerned about the military-industrial complex. He said that we should beware of them and keep an eye on them, because they would do things that were in their interests and not necessarily in our interests. And this, I believe, is exactly what has happened. That a small group of people benefit from this aura of fear. And you know Dr. Carol Rosen, as I do, and she worked with Werner von Braun for some time. And he kept warning her after he sort of mellowed that this industrial military complex had to have an enemy in order to justify such huge military expenditures when people are starving all over the world and dying from lack of medical care and so on. And he said first it will be the communists, and they had a good run at the communists. And then he said it will be the terrorists, and now they're having a good run at the terrorists. And then he said it will be the extraterrestrials, and now they're trying to get money to establish a base on the moon and do other things, which some of us feel is probably more military oriented than it is scientifically oriented, at least as much so. And without really the American people ever having given sanction, they have no mandate to do that. No government has run on the platform of spending public money for the militarization of space. On the contrary, I think most people say, hey, this is a common area. It should be available for the utilization of all mankind and for the betterment of all mankind. But we've got this roadblock as long as a small, well, I call them cabal in the book, who are the hardcore of the shadow government that everyone talks about, which I also talk about in the book, refuse to come clean, and I think that they're going to have to come clean at some stage, and Congress is the organization that's going to have to force them to do that.
And your book is very comprehensive because you talk about all of these and the way we should approach other civilizations in the world. And you use as the most powerful phrase the golden rule. Can you give us some ideas how we can change our worldview so that we are not a warring species killing each other, we are not judgmental over people that do not look like us or live like us? Can you imagine if it were aliens? And how can you give us some ideas how this can be accomplished? Because I know this is your passion.
Well, I think we live in an unhappy world where many things are going wrong, and I start my book out by saying I think we have about 10 years to turn around and convert from fossil fuels to a new exotic energy or energies, not the 30 or 40 years that all the politicians are talking about, because that, in my opinion, will probably be too late. And the global warming will proceed to the point where some countries are devastated, like Bangladesh, for example, which could wind up underwater, and many of the Pacific Islands, and maybe eventually Manhattan, who knows. And so we're headed hell-bent for our own destruction if we don't change. And yet you go back and read history, and I have a section on this, of almost every major religion at some stage has taken on some other major religion and attempted to kill them off, or some of them, while at the same time proclaiming in their basic rules that they believe in treating other people the way they would want to be treated. And yet in action, they do just the opposite. And I'm calling for a year of forgiveness, where all of the people who have fought others over the last 2,000 years or more forgive whoever did it, and it's two ways in almost every case, and then start cooperating in building the kingdom of God, which I define as a world where everybody has enough to eat, and some clean water to drink, and a roof over their head, and enough clothes to be decent, and sufficient access to education to give them a reasonable opportunity to be able to use their skills creatively. And this would produce really the kind of world that we all talk about and dream about and hope about, but do very little about. And it's interesting, if you want to go back to the UFO thing for a minute, that one of the early Canadian pioneers in this field, Wilbur Smith, who had access to information from the star visitors, as some of us like to call them, said that we've reached the stage, and certainly he got this from them, where we have to choose between good and evil. And if we keep on doing evil against our fellow man, in the generic sense, the world is doomed. Whereas if, on the other hand, we were to choose doing good in all of the ways that are open to us, and especially with all of this technology, then we could create a world which would be absolutely stunning in the opportunities that it provides for everyone. So this is the point that we're at, and I think the extraterrestrials are very, very interested in which way we go, whether we go forward, which I would say was the way of cooperation, or whether we just keep on saying, well, my power or my wish to be president of this country or to be the dictator of this country or whatever is such and so strong, and I have such a reason for it that I'll be glad to use armed forces to kill my enemies and lock them up if they get too powerful, and so on. In other words, the things that we've been doing and are still continuing to do in many parts of the world.
Your book is very, very personal. The area of the exotic alternatives to fossil fuels the area of world political cooperation using the golden rules, because you tend to put yourself in the other person's moccasins, and the revamping of the planetary monetary system, and transparency in government. Of those things I mentioned, can you talk to me about the one issue that's near and dear to your heart, and finally tell us how maybe we could fix it?
Well, the issue that is most urgent at the moment is changing the world monetary system, the banking system. And this is a long story, and I know you don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but it is critically important. The banking system that we have is, to put it bluntly, legalized fraud, to put it in bold terms. And we have to change it for the benefit of all. There are many things in my book that you will know from having read it, where I talk about the world being run by a very small group of elite people who are immensely wealthy and who want to stay that way. They want to have the stranglehold on the resources and the wealth of the world. And so they have introduced globalization, which really hasn't benefited anybody except them in a tangible way. And they want to keep a banking system which has brought more than 25 recessions and depressions in the United States in the last 120 years. And now, after one of the most serious meltdowns, well, the most serious meltdown since the Great Depression, they're pretending that they're fixing the system, and they're not. It's just a pretense. And they're pretending to slap the hands of the bankers who are responsible for it, and it is just a tap in the hand. It's like finding a prostitute $20 for being on the street, knowing that she's going to go back out the next night and earn more than that. And the banks are doing exactly the same thing. They're just laughing all the way to their balls. So this is a profound area. Maybe it might be interesting if I could just go through a bit of the history in maybe 3 or 4 minutes or 5. I just go back to the time when King William was fighting a war and ran out of money. Somebody said, well, one way to get some more money is to start a bank. So he got the rich people of England to subscribe £1,200,000 in gold and silver and lend it all to the government at 8%, which is a pretty high interest rate for a government guaranteed loan. But that's the way things go. And then to show their gratitude, the government allowed the bank to print another £1,200,000 in banknotes and lend it to their friends at high interest rates. So in other words, they were allowed to lend the same money twice. Well, then over the years, through the greed of the bankers and the cooperation, use a polite word, of politicians, that ratio has increased dramatically. In the early years of the 20th century, the federal banks in the United States had to have a gold reserve of 25%, which meant that they could lend the same money 4 times. In my early years in Canada, they had to have a cash reserve of 8%, which meant they could lend the same money 12.5 times. And today, with this new system of capital adequacy, which isn't really adequacy at all, it should be capital inadequacy, they are lending the same money 20 times and collecting interest on it each time. Now that is just legalized fraud. And the fact that a tiny minority of rich people can get away with it, I think is a disgrace. So I've been saying we have to reduce that ratio of 20 to 1 to say 3 to 1, and reduce the amount of the proportion of money that banks create from nearly a monopoly to I'm suggesting 2/3, so that governments who own the patent on behalf of the people can print 1/3 of the money, 34% is the figure that I use in the book, and use that to balance their budgets and pay for health care and pay for the transition from an oil economy to something that would save the world from global warming, and do other things that are essential, like providing basic food and shelter for people all over the world and giving the poor people a bit of a break. So this is what's got to happen. And I hope it happens sooner rather than later, because if it doesn't, then what is going to happen is that we'll go for another 5 or 10 or 15 years and have another meltdown. And a few more million people will lose their jobs and their houses and their businesses. And the thing goes on and on until somebody really does something about it. And it's going to take a lot of guts to stand up to the banking industry, because they're a tough bunch and they would spend billions to keep this from happening. But at the same time, it would be the greatest service to mankind that any leader or group of leaders could do. And I just hope and pray that they will get at it, try and understand how the system works, which very few people do, but which you can learn in a few hours, and then make the change and give the world a break.
You have said in the beginning of the book that we are hell-bent on destruction, and you have also delineated a lot of the crisis in the planet, including the UFO cover-up and the economic problem and the spiritual problem that we do not accept each other and are still warring about this. If you were to give a message to the young people, a legacy that you wanted to leave, something that would help them change the status quo and enter this new world as you and I look at it, what would be your advice on a very basic level?
My advice to the young people of the world would be, it has to start with individuals. I used to describe this sort of thing like a beach. If the majority of the grains of sand on the beach are clean, it will look beautiful, golden, and be very hospitable. If the majority are covered with oil slick, dirty, or translated into the wider problem, evil, or uncaring or self-centered, then you have a dirty beach, which is very unattractive. And that is much of what's going on in the world today. We have very little personal integrity. Every time you pick up a paper, somebody's ripping off somebody. The government officials are ripping off the people, or some people are trying to rip off the government by not paying their taxes or something to show that they're going in the opposite way to what we have to go. But this has to start with individual people, and it has to come from the bottom up, not from the top down, although I must say that, good leadership is very important, and if you can get somebody with high moral and ethical standards at the top, this will rub off on some of the younger people. But basically, the young people have to change the world one at a time, individually, and try to make their motto to leave the world in a little better place than when they found it. And if everyone does that, they'll plant a tree or two, or pick up a can or two, or do whatever is necessary, donate $1 or $2 for somebody else that's in worse situation than they are. And then, if enough people do that, they will then put the political pressure on the leaders to make the macro changes that are essential to change the monetary system and to stop global warming and to do the other things that have to be done to, in effect, save the world.